In 4 years, one single war killed more Americans than World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Brothers shot brothers, fathers shot sons, and by the time it ended, the country that walked out the other side was not even remotely the same country that walked in. This is the story of how America almost destroyed itself just to figure out what it actually was. Let's rewind, because the real story is way messier than the one you got in school. By the early 1800s, America was already living two completely different lives stitched together under one flag. The North was industrializing fast, building factories, railroads, and cities, running on wage labor and immigration. The South stayed almost entirely agricultural, its entire economy built directly on the backs of enslaved people, and specifically on cotton, which by this point was America's single most valuable export by a mile. Two economies, two cultures, two very different visions of what the country should even be, crammed into one government that increasingly could not agree on anything, and the one issue neither side could keep dodging was slavery. Every time America expanded west, and it expanded constantly, the same brutal question came up again: new states, slave or free? For decades, Congress basically played an exhausting game of political Jenga, passing one shaky compromise after another just to keep the country from collapsing. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each one just delayed the inevitable. And honestly, each one made both sides angrier than the last. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court dropped a bombshell so extreme, it basically poured gasoline directly onto an already burning house. In the Dred Scott decision, the court ruled that Black Americans, enslaved or free, could never be citizens, and that Congress had no constitutional right to ban slavery in new territories at all. The North was furious, the South was thrilled, and the fragile political peace that had barely been holding the country together for decades basically evaporated overnight. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, and here's the part that always surprises people. Lincoln did not run promising to abolish slavery nationwide. His actual position was that slavery should not expand into new territories. That's it. That was considered radical enough, because to the South, even that felt like an existential threat, proof that their entire way of life was on borrowed time. Before Lincoln had even taken office, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Within weeks, 6 more states followed. They formed their own nation, the Confederate States of America, and picked Jefferson Davis as their president, essentially trying to get a divorce from the country before the wedding photos had even developed. In April of 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in South Carolina, and just like that, the talking was over. The Civil War had officially begun, and almost nobody involved had any idea what they were actually walking into. Both sides genuinely believed this would be quick. Soldiers signed up expecting a short, glorious adventure. Home by Christmas, medals, parades, the whole fantasy. Spectators from Washington actually packed picnic baskets and rode out to watch the first major battle at Bull Run like it was a sporting event, which is possibly the single worst life decision in American tailgating history, because it turned into a chaotic, bloody Confederate victory, and those same spectators ended up fleeing back toward the Capitol in an actual panic. Turns out, war is not, in fact, a fun day trip. From there, the war exploded into something nobody was remotely prepared for. New technology collided head-on with old-fashioned tactics in the worst possible way. Rifled muskets could now kill accurately from far greater distances, but generals on both sides were still ordering soldiers to march forward in tight, exposed formations straight into that gunfire. Tactics basically copied from decades earlier when guns were far less accurate. The result was slaughter on a scale America had never seen, and honestly still struggles to fully comprehend. Antietam, in September of 1862, remains the single bloodiest day in all of American history. Over 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing in about 12 hours. For context, that is more American casualties in one single day than the United States suffered in the entire Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Mexican-American War combined. One day. In the middle of all this carnage, Lincoln made a move that fundamentally changed what the entire war was even about. In January of 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory free. It didn't actually free everyone everywhere, and it was as much a strategic wartime weapon as it was a moral stand, but symbolically, it completely transformed the conflict. This was no longer just a war about preserving the Union. It was now, unmistakably, also a war about ending slavery, and it opened the door for roughly 200,000 black soldiers to formally join the Union Army, men fighting directly for their own freedom and the freedom of millions of others. By 1863, the war reached its most legendary turning point at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a 3-day battle so massive and so brutal it remains the single largest battle ever fought on American soil. Confederate General Robert E. Lee gambled everything on an invasion of the North, and it ended in catastrophic failure, including a doomed frontal assault known as Pickett's Charge, where thousands of Confederate soldiers marched directly across an open field into a wall of Union artillery. It went about as well as you'd expect, which is to say, it did not go well at all. The Confederacy never fully recovered from Gettysburg. Months later, Lincoln stood on that same battlefield and delivered a speech that lasted barely 2 minutes, a speech he himself apparently thought had basically flopped in the moment. That 2-minute speech is the Gettysburg Address, and it is now considered one of the most important pieces of political rhetoric ever spoken by anyone, anywhere, in the history of the English language. Sometimes the shortest thing you write ends up outliving literally everything else you ever do, which honestly should terrify every overthinking writer out there. The war ground on for 2 more brutal years, and by 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman adopted a strategy that was less about defeating armies on a battlefield and more about breaking the South's ability to fight at all. His infamous March to the Sea tore through Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, farms, basically anything that could sustain the Confederate war effort. It was devastating, and it worked, though it remains one of the more controversial military campaigns in American history for exactly that reason. Finally, in April of 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over, and then, just 5 days later, in one of the single cruelest twists of timing in American history, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, shot dead less than a week after finally seeing the war he had led the entire country through come to an end. He never got to see a single day of the peace he had actually won. When it was finally over, the numbers were almost impossible to process. Somewhere between 620,000 and 800,000 soldiers were dead, more American lives lost than in every other American war in the country's history combined, a statistic that genuinely still holds true today. Roughly 4 million enslaved people were freed. The Union was preserved by force, not by choice, and the entire economic and political structure of the South was permanently reshaped, whether the South wanted it reshaped or not. But here's the part that really should stick with you. The Civil War did not just decide whether slavery would continue or the Union would survive. It fundamentally decided what kind of country America was even going to be going forward. A stronger, more centralized federal government, a completely reworked understanding of who actually counted as a citizen, an economy permanently shifted away from agriculture and directly toward industry. Almost everything about modern America, its laws, its identity, its ongoing arguments about race and federal power that are honestly still playing out on the news right now, traces directly back to what happened in those 4 brutal years. Every single conversation America is still having about equality, about states versus federal power, about who this country actually belongs to, all of it runs directly back through this one war, fought entirely by Americans against other Americans over exactly what kind of nation this was ever going to become. And that's the part that should really sit with you. This isn't some distant story about a country far away, long ago. This is the origin story of the exact country that exists right now, today, still arguing about almost the exact same questions it went to war over more than a century and a half ago.